Welcome, thrill seekers, to another spine-tingling episode of the Ghost Riders podcast. Tonight, we've got 3 eerie tales that will make you question every shadow and every whisper in the dark. First, we have The Phantom Highwayman, where a mysterious rider stalks a lonely road, his intentions as foggy as the night that conceals him. Then, we'll plunge into the cursed history of the Collector, where an obsession with rare artifacts leads to a terrifying fate. And finally, we'll unravel the mystery of the Vanishing Village, a place that slipped through the cracks of time itself. Are you ready to face the unknown? Then buckle up and prepare for a ride into the darkness. The Phantom Highwayman. It was a foggy night on Highway 13, the kind of fog that clings to the ground like a ghostly blanket, swallowing the headlights and muffling every sound. Emily Thompson gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white as she squinted into the murk, trying to keep her car on the barely visible road. The old radio crackled with static, the only companion she had on this desolate stretch of asphalt. She was halfway through the longest leg of her trip, miles from the nearest town, when she saw it, just a flicker at first, a shadow moving in the mist. But then it became clear, a lone figure on horseback, standing motionless in the middle of the road. Emily's heart leapt into her throat. She slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching in protest as the car skidded to a halt just inches from the figure. Her breath caught as she stared at the rider, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, his long coat billowing in the wind that seemed to come from nowhere. The horse pawed the ground, its breath visible in the cold night air, but the rider didn't move. He just sat there, as still as a statue, as if waiting for something, or someone. Emily's pulse raced. She fumbled for the car's gear shift, her hands trembling. She needed to get out of here, now. But as she shifted into reverse, the figure suddenly raised a hand, pointing directly at her. A chill ran down her spine, colder than the fog that seeped into the car. She felt an inexplicable pull, an urge to drive forward, to follow wherever the rider wanted to take her. But something deep inside her screamed to resist, to turn around and flee. The rider lowered his hand and urged his horse forward, the animal's hooves clopping hollowly on the pavement. Emily's foot hovered over the gas pedal, indecision tearing at her. Then, without warning, the rider broke into a gallop, charging straight at her. Emily's instincts kicked in. She slammed her foot down, the car lurching backward as the headlights illuminated the rider's face for the first time, a face twisted in a malevolent grin, eyes like burning coals. She screamed and floored the accelerator, the tires spinning on the wet road as the car fish-tailed wildly. The rider was nearly upon her, the horse's breath steaming in the cold night, when she finally regained control, jerking the wheel and spinning the car around. Emily didn't look back. She sped down the highway, the fog closing in behind her, erasing any trace of the ghostly figure that had pursued her. But even as she raced away, she could still feel his eyes on her, the burning gaze seared into her memory. As she drove, her mind raced. Who was he? What did he want? The questions gnawed at her, but the road ahead offered no answers, only more darkness and the relentless fog that seemed to thicken with every mile. The minutes stretched into an eternity as Emily pushed the car faster, her eyes darting nervously to the rearview mirror. The road twisted and turned, and the trees lining the highway loomed like silent sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. And then, just when she thought she had left the rider behind, the radio crackled to life. A low, haunting voice filled the car, a voice that seemed to rise from the depths of the mist itself. "You can't escape me, Emily," the voice whispered, sending a jolt of terror through her. She gasped, her grip tightening on the steering wheel as she glanced wildly around the car. But there was no one there, only the fog and the empty road. The voice continued, soft and insistent, filling her mind with images she couldn't shake. A dark forest, the thundering of hooves, the cold steel of a blade glinting in the moonlight. It was as if the rider was inside her head, pulling her into his world, his time. "No," Emily shouted, shaking her head violently as if to dislodge the voice. She hit the radio's power button, but the voice persisted, growing louder, more commanding. "Turn around, Emily. Come to me." Her vision blurred with tears of fear and frustration. She wanted to escape, but the pull was irresistible. Her hands moved of their own accord, turning the wheel, guiding the car in a slow, inexorable U-turn back toward the place where she had encountered the rider. The fog seemed to part as she drove back, revealing the dark silhouette of the rider waiting in the middle of the road. The horse's eyes glowed red in the darkness, and the rider's grin widened, revealing teeth that gleamed like polished steel. She couldn't stop herself. Emily knew she was heading straight into danger, but her mind was no longer her own. The rider had taken control, drawing her closer with every second, every beat of her heart. As she neared the rider, the fog closed in around the car, thick and suffocating. The headlights dimmed, the engine sputtered, and Emily's hands went slack on the wheel. She was only a few feet from him now, close enough to see the gleam of his eyes beneath the brim of his hat, the flash of a blade at his side. But just as the rider reached out to claim her, something within Emily snapped. With a scream of defiance, she slammed her foot down on the gas pedal, the car surging forward in a desperate bid for freedom. The rider's hand brushed against the windshield as the car sped past him, his fingertips leaving a trail of frost on the glass. Emily didn't dare look back as she tore down the highway, the fog swirling furiously in her wake. The voice was gone, the radio silent, but Emily could still feel the rider's presence, lingering in the shadows of her mind. He was out there, waiting, watching. And she knew, deep down, that she had only narrowly escaped his grasp. It wasn't until she reached the safety of the next town that she dared to pull over, her hands shaking uncontrollably on the steering wheel. She sat there for a long time, the engine idling, trying to convince herself that it had all been a hallucination, a trick of the fog. But deep down, she knew better. The rider was real, and he was still out there, waiting for the next traveller to cross his path. And Emily swore that no matter what, she would never take that highway again. Because some legends never die, and some ghosts never rest. And there you have it, the story of the Phantom Highwayman. Was it the fog playing tricks on Emily, or did she really encounter a ghost from the past? The question is, could this really be happening? While you determine if this story is true or not, here's our next tale. The Cursed Collector. There's a certain allure to collecting. For some, it's the thrill of the hunt, the chase for that one rare item that will complete a set, the joy of finding something that speaks to them on a deeply personal level. But for others, the obsession can take a darker turn, as it did for Victor Marshall. Victor wasn't just any collector, he was a man possessed. His home was a veritable museum of curiosities, filled with objects from every corner of the globe, ancient relics, mysterious artifacts, and things that defied explanation. He had always believed that each item held a story, a piece of history that only he could unlock. But his latest acquisition would prove to be different, something far more dangerous. It arrived one rainy afternoon, packed in an old wooden crate, delivered by a man who seemed all too eager to be rid of it. Victor watched as the delivery man practically threw the crate onto his doorstep before hurrying away, his face pale and eyes wide with what Victor could only describe as fear. Undeterred, Victor dragged the crate inside and pried it open with eager hands. Inside, wrapped in layers of yellowed cloth, was a small, ornately carved wooden box. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the carvings intricate and precise, depicting scenes of ancient rituals and strange symbols that Victor couldn't quite decipher. But there was something else about the box, something that sent a shiver down Victor's spine as he ran his fingers over its surface. It was as if the box was watching him. Victor shook off the feeling, dismissing it as his imagination, and carried the box to his study. He placed it on his desk, under the soft glow of a lamp, and carefully examined it from every angle. There was no lock, no visible mechanism to open it, just the smooth, polished wood and the strange carvings that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. He spent hours trying to figure out how to open the box, his frustration growing with each failed attempt. Finally, in a fit of anger, he slammed his hand down on the desk, and the box sprang open. Victor gasped, his heart pounding as he stared at the contents. Inside the box was a small vial of liquid, a bundle of what looked like old, brittle parchment, and a single blood-red stone that seemed to glow from within. The air in the room grew thick, oppressive, as if the box had unleashed something into the atmosphere, something dark and malevolent. Victor's curiosity was piqued, but there was also a growing sense of unease, a feeling that he had made a terrible mistake. Ignoring the warning bells in his mind, Victor reached for the vial, lifting it to the light. The liquid inside was thick and dark, almost black, and it moved sluggishly within the glass, as if alive. A strange urge came over him, a compulsion to open the vial, to see what would happen if he released its contents. But as his fingers moved to uncork the vial, a voice, soft, almost a whisper, seemed to echo in his mind. "Don't." Victor froze, his hand trembling. The voice wasn't his own, and it wasn't coming from the room around him. It was coming from within the box, from the very items he now held in his hands. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts, but the voice persisted, growing louder, more insistent. "Don't open it. Leave it alone." Victor set the vial down, his breath coming in ragged gasps. What was happening to him? Was he losing his mind? But even as he questioned his sanity, he couldn't shake the feeling that the box was trying to communicate with him, trying to warn him. Determined to understand what he was dealing with, Victor unwrapped the parchment, his hands trembling with a mix of fear and anticipation. The parchment was old, fragile, the ink faded, but the words were still legible, an ancient script that Victor had encountered only once before in his studies of forbidden texts. The message was clear, a warning etched in blood and ink. This box contains the cursed remnants of a dark ritual, sealed away to prevent its power from spreading. It must never be opened. To do so is to invite death and despair. Victor's heart skipped a beat. He stared at the box, the vial, the stone, and felt a wave of dread wash over him. He had opened something that was never meant to be opened, something that had been sealed away for a reason. He knew he had to get rid of it, to destroy it before it was too late. But as he reached for the box, a sudden paralyzing fear gripped him. The air around him grew cold, the shadows in the room deepened, and the whispers in his mind grew louder, more urgent. The stone in the box began to glow brighter, its red light casting eerie shadows on the walls. Victor felt a pull toward it, a compulsion to pick it up, to hold it in his hand. He fought the urge, but it was too strong, too overwhelming. As soon as his fingers closed around the stone, a jolt of energy shot through him, freezing him in place. The whispers became screams, filling his mind with visions of death, of chaos, of a world consumed by darkness. He saw himself at the center of it all, a puppet controlled by the cursed objects he had so foolishly unleashed. Victor's grip tightened on the stone, his knuckles white, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could feel his will slipping away, his mind fracturing under the weight of the box's malevolent influence. The last shred of his sanity screamed at him to let go, to destroy the box before it consumed him entirely. But it was too late. The box had him, and it wasn't letting go. In a final, desperate act, Victor hurled the stone across the room, the glowing red gem smashing into the wall and shattering into 1,000 pieces. The force of the impact knocked him to the ground, and he lay there, gasping for breath, his mind reeling from the sudden release. But the damage had been done. The box, now open, had unleashed its curse, and there was no way to stop it. The room around him began to warp and twist, reality itself bending to the will of the dark power he had released. Victor could feel it, the darkness closing in, creeping into every corner of his mind, consuming him from the inside out. He knew he was doomed, that the box would take him just as it had taken so many before him. But even as the shadows claimed him, he managed one final, desperate thought, a warning to whoever might find the box after him. Destroy it, before it's too late. And then, with a final, shuddering breath, Victor Marshall was gone, consumed by the very thing he had sought to control. The box, now closed, sat silently on the desk, its surface unmarred, its contents hidden once more. But the curse remained, waiting patiently for the next collector, the next victim to unleash its dark power. Because some things are better left untouched, some secrets better left buried. And that was the cursed collector. Was it greed, curiosity, or something darker that drove Victor to his fate? Perhaps some treasures are too dangerous to keep. While you ponder that, here's our final story. The Vanishing Village. There are places in this world that defy explanation, places where the veil between reality and the unknown is dangerously thin. One such place is a small, forgotten village nestled deep in the mountains, a place that few remember and even fewer can find. For those who stumble upon it, the experience is as haunting as it is unexplainable. This is the story of one such encounter. It was late autumn when a group of 4 friends set out on a hiking trip in the remote wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. The air was crisp, the leaves a riot of colors, and the sky a clear, unbroken blue. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway, a chance to escape the stress of their everyday lives and reconnect with nature. But as they ventured deeper into the mountains, the weather took an unexpected turn. The clear skies gave way to thick, rolling clouds, and a heavy fog descended upon the forest, turning the familiar trails into a labyrinth of shadows and uncertainty. "We should turn back," Sarah, the youngest of the group, suggested as she pulled her jacket tighter around her. But Mark, the unofficial leader, shook his head, his breath visible in the cold air. "We've come this far," he said, glancing at the map. "There's a village up ahead. We can stop there, wait out the fog, and head back in the morning." The others reluctantly agreed, and they pressed on, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves. As they walked, the forest grew eerily quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife replaced by the soft rustling of the fog as it swirled around them. After what felt like hours, they emerged into a clearing, and there it was, the village, just as Mark had said. But something about it felt off. The houses were old, their wooden walls weathered and grey, as if they had stood there for centuries. Yet there was no sign of life, no smoke rising from the chimneys, no lights shining in the windows. "Maybe they're all inside because of the fog," David suggested, though even he didn't sound convinced. The village had an aura of abandonment, a sense of stillness that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. "Let's just find a place to stay for the night," Mark said, his voice low. "We'll figure it out in the morning." They approached the nearest house, a small, squat building with a sagging roof and a door that hung slightly ajar. Mark knocked, but there was no answer. He pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in protest, and they stepped inside. The interior was just as unwelcoming as the outside, dust-covered furniture, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling, and a fireplace that hadn't seen a fire in years. But it was shelter, and they were tired, cold, and ready to rest. They settled in for the night, lighting a small fire to ward off the chill. But as the flames flickered and cast long shadows across the room, an uneasy feeling settled over the group. The silence of the village was oppressive, as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for something. "I don't like this place," Sarah whispered, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "It feels wrong." Mark nodded, though he didn't voice his agreement. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the village itself was aware of their presence. But there was nothing to be done. They would leave in the morning, and this place would be nothing more than a strange memory. As the night wore on, the fog outside thickened, pressing against the windows like a living thing. The fire burned low, and one by one they drifted off to sleep, though their dreams were anything but restful. Sarah awoke with a start in the middle of the night, her heart pounding. She sat up, straining to hear what had woken her, but the house was silent. The others were still asleep, their breaths slow and steady, but something wasn't right. The fog outside had crept into the house, swirling around the floor in thin tendrils. She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the last vestiges of sleep, and as she did, she noticed something, or someone, standing just outside the doorway. A figure, tall and dark, barely visible through the thick mist. She blinked, sure that her eyes were playing tricks on her, but the figure remained, unmoving. "Mark," she called softly, but there was no response. She reached over and shook him awake, her hand trembling. "What is it?" he mumbled, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. "There's someone outside," she whispered, her voice shaking. Mark's expression turned serious, and he got to his feet, moving quietly toward the door. He peered out into the fog, but there was nothing there, only the dense mist swirling around the entrance. "There's no one out there," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The unease that had settled over them all day had grown into something more, a deep, gnawing fear that they weren't alone in this village. They spent the rest of the night huddled together, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house, jumping at every sound. When morning finally came, it brought little relief. The fog had only grown thicker, and the village was even more ominous in the cold, grey light of day. "We need to leave," David said, his voice tense. "Now." They gathered their things quickly, eager to put the village behind them. But as they stepped outside, they realized with growing horror that the trail they had followed into the village was gone. In its place was a dense wall of trees, the path completely obscured by the fog. Panic set in as they searched for any sign of the trail, but it was as if the forest had swallowed it whole. They were trapped. "We'll have to find another way out," Mark said, though the fear in his voice was clear. They set off into the forest, but no matter which direction they went, they always ended up back in the village, standing by the same dilapidated houses, the same crumbling well in the center of the square. "It's like the village is moving," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like it doesn't want us to leave." The hours dragged on, their fear growing with each passing minute. The fog seemed to grow denser, pressing in on them from all sides, until they could barely see more than a few feet in front of them. And then, just when they thought all hope was lost, they heard it, a faint, distant sound, like the ringing of a bell. It was coming from deep within the village, from a place they hadn't yet explored. With no other options, they followed the sound, their footsteps echoing eerily in the fog. The bell grew louder, clearer, until they found themselves standing in front of a small, ancient church at the edge of the village. The door was ajar, and the bell was tolling from somewhere within. Mark pushed the door open, and they stepped inside, the fog clinging to them like a second skin. The interior of the church was dark, the only light coming from a single candle burning on the altar. The bell had stopped ringing, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. They moved cautiously down the aisle, the wooden floorboards creaking under their weight. As they reached the altar, the candle flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. And then they saw it, a figure, dressed in tattered robes, standing in the shadows behind the altar. The figure's face was hidden beneath a hood, but they could feel its eyes on them, watching, waiting. "What do you want?" Mark demanded, his voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing to something on the altar. They looked down and saw a small, ancient book lying there, its pages yellowed with age. The cover was inscribed with strange symbols, ones that none of them could read. Mark hesitated, then reached out to pick up the book. As his fingers touched the cover, the figure vanished, leaving only the faint echo of a whisper in the air. "Read it," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Mark opened the book, and as he did, a gust of wind swept through the church, extinguishing the candle and plunging them into darkness. He fumbled for a moment, then struck a match, the small flame illuminating the pages. The words inside were written in a language none of them recognized, but as Mark read aloud, the air grew thick with a strange energy, the very walls of the church seeming to close in around them. And then, as if in response to the words, the fog outside began to lift, revealing the path that had been hidden from them. The village, once shrouded in mystery and fear, now seemed almost ordinary in the light of day. They didn't wait to question what had happened. With the book in hand, they left the church, following the newly revealed path out of the village and back into the forest. As they walked, the fog continued to lift, and by the time they reached the edge of the forest, the sun was shining down on them, warm and welcoming. The village was gone, swallowed by the forest once more, leaving behind only the strange book as proof that it had ever existed. But as they looked back one last time, they knew they had been changed by the experience. The village was more than just a place. It was a mystery, a puzzle that had no solution, a glimpse into something far beyond their understanding. And as they walked away, they could still hear the faint tolling of the bell, a sound that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Because some places aren't meant to be found, and some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Reveal an outro, and that was the story of the vanishing village. Was it a glimpse into a forgotten past, or something far more mysterious? The truth, as it turns out, might be scarier than fiction. Before you decide, here's the big reveal. Out of tonight's 3 stories, only one is based on true events, and that story was The Vanishing Village. This eerie tale is not just a figment of imagination. It's a documented mystery that has puzzled investigators and intrigued researchers for years. Special thanks to MudasirMT66 for the story posted on medium.com. This story is inspired by the original true story and rewritten for this podcast. As for the Phantom Highwayman and the Cursed Collector, well, those were just stories, at least as far as we know. Did I fool you? Did you get it right? If so, congratulations. You're as sharp as they come. If not, there's always next time. Thank you for joining me for tonight's eerie explorations. Remember, not all tales are fiction, and sometimes the truth is even stranger. Join us next week for 3 more stories that will keep you questioning what's real and what's not. Until then, stay curious and stay safe.